Hey everybody, welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be discussing accessibility and how we can make our websites work for as many people as possible, or optimally, we want our websites to be usable by the entire population. And when we talk about accessibility, we're referring to people using the internet in different ways, as well as people with different abilities that can affect the ways that they can consume our content. So for example, some people navigate the internet using only a keyboard rather than a keyboard and a mouse. Moreover, rather than using a screen to visually look at the output, some people use a screen reader that verbally tells them the contents of the website. And we need to be accounting for all of these different cases and a bunch more to make sure that our website is working for as many people as possible. In many of these cases, our users will be using assistive technologies such as a screen reader to interact with our website. And these assistive technologies actually don't interact with the DOM directly. Instead, they interact with what's known as the accessibility tree, which is a tree containing content specific to accessibility that is easier for these assistive technologies to understand. Each node in these trees has four main components to it. First, a name, which is oftentimes synonymous with the text content of that node, but not always. The description can provide some more information on top of that name. It's a little bit more detailed for times when we need a little bit more context about the element. Next, the role explains what exactly the node is doing. For example, a checkbox would have the checkbox role. And then we have state, and the state provides any current state about that node. So in the case of a checkbox, it could have a checked state or an unchecked state. And lots of different roles have different options for their state. Originally, we said we had this HTML file, which got converted into the DOM. Then the DOM is converted into the actual UI, which is shown to the end user. However, this isn't always the case. The DOM is actually split in two. One is converted into a user interface, but it's also converted into the accessibility tree, which is used for these assistive technologies. And then these assistive technologies also go to the user. So users can take the input of our content in two different ways. This means that at the core of writing accessible HTML is writing HTML that will properly fill out the accessibility tree. And there's a few ways we can focus on doing that. So first, we need to make sure we are using descriptive content, labels, and alt attributes. Next, we want to make sure we are using the semantically appropriate elements. When we do this, the accessibility tree will get automatically filled in based on what element we use. However, if we use generic elements, such as a div, which is just a generic wrapper element, then we will have a very unspecific accessibility tree, and our website won't be very accessible. In addition to focusing on the accessibility tree, we also want to ensure our website is usable with keyboard controls. This means ensuring that somebody can navigate to all of the major portions of the website using just a keyboard, and that they can properly interact with all of our inputs. Most of the time, just writing good semantic HTML is enough to keep our websites accessible. However, sometimes we need to write more complex web applications, and these end up using less semantic tags for some specific use cases. And because of this, there's a new initiative created called WAI-ARIA, or the Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. This is usually just referred to as ARIA, and it was written by W3C. ARIA provides more attributes that we can use in HTML to further describe our content and fill out the accessibility tree. So first we have the ARIA role, and this allows us to define the role of the element, which can be used in the accessibility tree role. Next, we have properties, and these allow us to provide some extra meaning, such as giving a label to an element that doesn't usually have one. And finally, we can provide some state, which again aligns to the accessibility tree state and allows us to provide state to elements that usually don't have it, such as if we have a disabled state. ARIA roles are broken down into a variety of different categories, the first of these being landmark roles. And the landmarks are simply major content areas or navigational landmarks. Oftentimes, these are what the user will navigate to first when they are using assistive technology. Some examples of these are banners, the main content, or navigation. And you might notice that these are very similar to what we have in semantic grouping tags. And in fact, semantic grouping tags all have a landmark role associated with them, And for that reason, we should almost always be using those tags instead of manually setting a landmark role. However, it can be nice to know that we can do that if we ever need to. Next, we have structure roles. And structure roles are very similar to landmark roles in that they define some structure of the page, they explain what a section of content is doing. However, the difference is that a landmark role is a navigational landmark, something that a user might want to go to first, whereas a structure role is a little bit less important. It's smaller pieces of structure, such as a tooltip, a list, or a table. Widget roles identify interactive elements. So when we use something like a div, but we want a user to be able to know that they can click on it, to interact with it, to do something with it, we use the widget role. Some examples of these can be tabs, a search box, or a button. And again, you'll see that some of these align to elements that we already have in HTML, and in those cases, you should almost always use the proper HTML tag rather than adding a widget role manually, but there are some widget roles that exist that we don't have a tag that directly maps to it, and in those cases, widget roles are good to be using. Next, we have window roles, and window roles create sub-windows within the browser, so this is removing some content from the rest of the page to say that it is separate from it. This is usually in the form of a modal, but not always. There are only two types of window roles currently, and that is a dialog and an alert dialog. A dialog does just that. It removes some content from the rest of the flow of the browser and says that this content is different. It is sort of a piece of dialogue. It is separate. An alert dialog does the exact same thing, except it is an alert, meaning that it has high importance and it's something that needs the user's attention immediately. Next, we have live region roles, and these define dynamically changing content. This means that anything inside of a live region role element will be checked on periodically by the assistive technology to inform the user of any changes to that content. Based on what type of role you use, it will determine how often the assistive technology is checking in on it and if it's looking at updates immediately or just periodically. Some examples of this will be a timer, a log of information that has happened over time, or an alert with new information that we need to tell the user. Similar to live region roles, we also have an attribute known as ARIA Live, and this attribute defines some live content, so dynamically changing content, and how important it is, so how often we need to be telling users about that changing content. Every live region role will have a default ARIA Live attribute value, but we can always change those manually using the ARIA Live attribute. We can also set them on things that do not have the live region role if there's not a role that actually correlates to what your content is, but it's still a live region. This attribute has three different values. First is off, which simply says that the content does not need to be watched by assistive technology, and any changes will not be announced to the user. Next, we have polite, which says that this content is changing, there's something dynamic here, but you don't necessarily need to revisit it super frequently. And usually what happens with this is the assistive technology will announce any changes when it's idle. So for example, a screen reader, when it's not currently saying anything, will go back to all of the live regions to see if there's any changes, and then it will announce those changes to the user. Finally, assertive means that this information is of the utmost importance and we need to tell the user about it as soon as possible. This is usually for things like alert messages that we need to tell the user about for them to be able to continue using the application or the website. Now let's go ahead and look at a few more ARIA properties that we can use to enhance the accessibility of our websites. So first we have the ARIA label attribute, and this allows you to label some element, but this label won't be visible on the UI when it gets rendered. It will just be part of the markup and part of the accessibility tree. This is really nice when there are times when there's some information that you could get just by looking at the website visually, but that somebody won't be able to get if they're using assistive technology such as a screen reader. Next, we have the ARIA labeled by attribute, and this works very similar to the for attribute that we've seen on labels, except it's in reverse. An element is able to say that some other element is its label. So in the example below of the dialog, you can see the H2 with successfully saved changes is being used as the label for the entire dialog. Next, we have the ARIA description, and what this does is it allows you to provide a more detailed description of an element, so it works just like ARIA labels, except it can be a little bit longer, it can be more detailed. And then ARIA described by works just like ARIA labeled by, except again, this is for a description, so it's meant for a long form description of the content rather than just a quick little heading or label about it. Now let's look at some ARIA states. So ARIA states provide stateful information about an element. This is usually used with inputs that we need to tell the user what the current state of that input is. And you'll notice that most of these are things we can get by default using the proper input tags. However, there are times when we can't use those input tags or there's just not an appropriate tag for what we need. And in those cases, setting ARIA state manually can be very helpful for our accessibility. First, we have ARIA checked, which is a state for elements with the role of checkbox, and this can be either true, false, or undefined. You can see in the example below, we have I am checked inside of a div with the role checkbox, and ARIA checked is set to true, meaning that this checkbox is currently checked. You might notice that this value is an actual string of true, and this is how most of the ARIA states will work. We need to provide string values of true or false, or occasionally undefined. And then we have ARIA disabled, which is useful for pretty much any type of input that we can tell a user, hey, this is currently disabled for whatever reason, so you can't currently interact with it. ARIA expanded is nice for accordion style elements where you open it and then you can see more content, and this can tell you if it's currently expanded or not. Similar to this, we have ARIA hidden, which can tell you if any content is currently not visible on the screen. Somebody using the UI would be able to see this visually, but when somebody's using assistive technology like a screen reader, they have no way to know if that content is currently being hidden by CSS, so we can add the ARIA hidden attribute, which tells the user just that. Next, we have ARIA pressed, which can tell the user about the current state of a toggle. Is it currently pressed in or is it not? Lastly, we have ARIA selected, which is pretty self-explanatory. It tells the user if an element is currently selected or not. And again, there are a bunch more ARIA states. You could imagine pretty much any time that you have some stateful information that you would want to tell the user, there's probably an ARIA state that is associated with that information that you can add to make your website more accessible. Now finally, there are some other concerns we should discuss related to accessibility that can't necessarily be solved using ARIA attributes or even using HTML at all. First is browser compatibility. Some people will inevitably be using older versions of browsers that they haven't updated in a long time, and we need to account for this. This sometimes means avoiding using the most cutting-edge new features of HTML and waiting a little bit of time before using those so that more people have updated their browsers to have compatibility with those new features. Next, we have CSS accessibility, or just generally our style accessibility. This means making sure our font sizes are clear and legible, our font choices are legible, and our colors are contrasting enough so that somebody can see the difference between different elements on the page very easily. Moreover, we need to be supporting different device sizes to make sure that somebody using a mobile phone, for instance, will have the same great experience as somebody using a large 4K monitor. Lastly, with larger web applications, and especially ones that have demographics outside of your current region, we need to consider internationalization, which is oftentimes abbreviated as I-18N. And what this means is how can we get our website to work in as many places and as many languages as possible. This means we need language support for different regions, but not just that, we need to make sure that our layout works regardless of what language somebody is using. For example, some languages have text that goes vertically instead of horizontally, and sometimes that can break a layout when somebody tries to translate the page, so we need to make sure that our website is robust enough to handle these different use cases. Now we've moved over to the code editor, and let's do a quick demo to demonstrate the power of the ARIA attributes. So in this demo, we have 3 tabs, tab 1, 2, and 3, and as we click through them, you can see we get different panels that display on the screen. And now if we look at the actual HTML that is accomplishing this, it's quite simple. In the head, we have a title, and then we have a script and a link tag. We don't need to worry about these too much. This is how we are linking in the JavaScript and the CSS, and we'll talk about this more in the JavaScript and CSS crash courses. But just know the CSS is giving these nice colors on the screen, and the JavaScript is what's hooking up the actual tabs to work. And then in the body, we have the actual markup for this page. So first we have an ordered list with 3 list items, tab 1, 2, and 3. And these correspond to the 3 tabs at the top of the page. And then we have 3 divs. And again, divs are just empty wrapper elements. And these represent each of the 3 panels. So we have panel 1, and this is the one you can currently see. Then we have panels 2 and 3. Now panels 2 and 3 each have a class hidden, which CSS is using to actually hide these. So anything with class hidden is not going to be displayed on the page at all. Now this is great and it works perfectly, but what about somebody using assistive technology like a screen reader? How would this work for them? Would they be able to understand this markup? Well, in the Chrome DevTools, we can actually get access to the accessibility tree and see what information they have to work on. So if we come over here and select any element, let's go into the ordered list, we can see to the right of these styles, we have an option for the accessibility tab. Inside of the accessibility tab, we get the accessibility tree, ARIA attributes, as well as some computed properties. So if we look at the accessibility tree, it's quite simple. We have a list, which makes sense, that represents the list of items. And then we have 3 list items, 1 for each tab. And then we can go into one of these list items and we can see the contents of it. So in this case, all it has is the static text of tab 1. And then we can see in the computed properties, it has no ARIA labels, it has no title, and the role is list item. And again, we can go back up and see that all of these are sort of the exact same. So then my question would be, if somebody had access to just this, how would they know that these are tabs? How would they know that they can click on them? All they see is that there's list items and they have some static text. And the answer to that is they wouldn't. There would be no way to know that these are actually interactive elements that the user can click on. And the way we can fix that is with our ARIA attributes. So let's come back over to our code and see if we can fix this code up to get it to work exactly how we would actually expect it to, so that somebody using these assistive technologies can interact with our website just as well as somebody who's using the actual monitor. So I think the first order of business here is to go ahead and assign some roles. Roles are really the first thing we usually want to do when we're working with ARIA attributes, is make sure that everything has a proper role. And right now this list and the list items had the list related roles, and that's not exactly what we want. We want these to be tabs. So let's go ahead and go into our ordered list and change the role. The role here we want is actually going to be tab list. And this is sort of like a list, but it's a list of tabs. That way the assistive technology knows that these are tabs that we can click on and choose what tab we want. And then each of the list items, we can give a role of tab. So this is sort of a list item for the tab list. And I'll go ahead and copy this over to each of the other list items. And next we need to go into these individual divs, so the individual panels, and let the accessibility tree know that these are panels for these tabs. So if we go into one of these, let's go to the top one, and we can go ahead and give it a role of tab panel. And what this says is that it's a panel associated with the tabs, and we can go ahead and copy this into each of these divs. Now this is a good start, but we need to actually connect the tabs with the tab panels. So if we go back up to the tabs, we can add another attribute, and this one is one we actually haven't seen yet, and it's called ARIA controls. And ARIA controls is an attribute that says that this is sort of controlling something else, and in this case, these tabs control whether or not another panel is visible. So we can say ARIA controls, and then we'll give it an ID. So let's say this one is panel 1. And I'll go ahead and copy this to the other tabs and change them to panel 2. And we can copy it one more time and make this panel 3. And then we need to come down into our tab panels and give them IDs that are the same as the values that we said are being controlled. So we can say this is panel 1. This one can be ID of panel 2. And then this last one down here can have an ID of panel 3. Now that we've told the accessibility tree which tabs are associated with which panels, we also need to tell it which one is currently selected. And by default, the first one is selected, so we'll give this first one an ARIA selected of true. And we can go ahead and move this onto new lines just to get everything easy to read. Go like that. And we can move this onto a new line as well. Okay, so now we have ARIA selected as true for the first value. And then the second one will be ARIA selected as false. And again, we can go to some new lines, get things nice and tidy, easy to read. Move these down, and We can move the content onto its own line as well, which I think just makes it nice and clear. And get some new lines here. And then finally, we can copy this aria selected as false into the last tab because this one is also not currently selected. And we can go ahead and move this one to new lines as well, just to be consistent with all the rest and make sure that we're not going way off the screen with our work. Great. So now what we have is we have these list items and they have aria controls, which says this is the panel that this is currently controlling. And then we have aria selected, which says whether or not this tab is the tab that is currently selected, the one that is currently in use. I'll also go ahead down here in this tab theory and move this over to be aligned with all of the other ones. So now the one last thing that we might want to do here is also add some labels, because we have these panels down here and they're not really labeled. We sort of just have these empty divs. And I think most of the time, if you have a div that doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot, especially if it has an aria role, it almost definitely needs a label as well. So what we can do with this, we could just do an aria label, but I think the better option here is to do aria labeled by and set these to be labeled by the actual tabs. So this one will be labeled by tab 1, and then we'll do the same thing for the other panels. So we can say that this one is labeled by tab 2, and since this one has the class hidden, it's starting to go off the page as well. So we can go ahead and go to new lines. All right, there we go. And then down here, we can do the exact same thing for this last one. So this one will be labeled by tab 3. And again, we can go down to new lines just to get everything fitting on the screen nicely. Perfect. And now if we go all the way back up to our tabs, we just need to give those IDs to these tabs because right now we have tab 1, 2, and 3, but it has no idea what that actually means. So we can go down here and say this is ID of tab 1. The second list item will be ID of tab 2. And then the third list item will be ID of tab 3. Okay, so now we should have some pretty complete aria attributes that are giving much better accessibility to our page. So let's review real quick, and then we'll play with this in the accessibility tree in the Chrome Inspector to see what everything is actually doing. So first, we changed our ordered list to have a role of tab list, saying that this is a list of tabs, so selectable tabs that we can click on and choose which tab we want to be on. And then inside of here, we have list items, which each have a role of tab, which says that this is one of the tabs in the tab list, and you can sort of click on it to select something. Specifically, you can click on it to control a panel with the ID, in this case, panel 1. And this one is already selected, so aria selected equals true, says that this one is selected, whereas the other ones are set to false because they are not currently selected. And then if we come down to the actual panels, we've given them a role of tab panel, which sort of associates them with those tabs. And then we have labeled them based on the tabs. So this one, for instance, is labeled by tab 1. This one is labeled by tab 2, and so on and so forth. And now I'll go ahead and refresh the browser and we can look through the exact same thing. So in the accessibility tree now, you can see this is changed to a tab list instead of just a list. Then we have tabs, tab 1, tab 2, and tab 3. So if we go into one of the tabs, for instance, we have a aria role, which says it's a tab, and we see that it controls panel 1. We also see that this one is currently selected, which is nice. And now if I go ahead and hit panel 2, you can see some values have changed in the DOM. And if we look at tab 1 now, it is now aria selected of false. And we could go down to tab 2, and this one is now aria selected of true. We can also come down to the actual tab panels and see that they have a role of tab panel as well as aria labeled by tab 1. You can actually see that this one being tab 1 is actually showing up as ignored, and that's because CSS is hiding it from the DOM. So we sort of implicitly get the aria hidden attribute, which is pretty nice. So most of the time, if you hide things using CSS, you actually don't need to worry about aria hidden, which is super great. It makes it much easier to deal with accessibility. But if we go down to panel 2, for instance, you'll see that this one has some information. It is tab panel 2, and then we have the paragraph inside with its static text. And if we go to that tab panel, see it has the role of tab panel, and it's labeled by tab 2. I hope this has been a useful demo to understand how exactly aria labels get used in the accessibility tree, and I hope it is clear that this version of the accessibility tree we have now is much easier for a screen reader or really any assistive technology to understand and to use, because it has much more useful information than just saying that these are some list items. Knowing that they're tabs and that they're controlling something else is really valuable information, and the only way that somebody using one of these assistive technology tools would be able to interact with our website at all. That's going to end this demo on accessibility with ARIA attributes, but one more point I did want to make is that I wouldn't recommend trying to memorize every single ARIA attribute and every single ARIA role. They'll come to you as you work more with accessibility, but it's really not a great use of time, just like it's not a great use of time to try to memorize every single HTML tag. There's always more to learn, more to do with accessibility. Even in this demo here, there's probably more we could do to label a few more things and be even more semantic with our HTML. But anyways, that's going to go ahead and end this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.